Here beginneth number 5, the Bedtime Bible Stories for Children by Homer Francis Rogers. Number 5 is Abram, Genesis 11:27 to 14:31. After many years passed, a lot of people were moving out to the frontier from the land of Mesopotamia. In the city of in Mesopotamia, there lived a fellow by the name of Terah, who had 3 sons, Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Terah was bitten by the travel bug and wanted to leave home, and for a long time he planned to sell his holdings in Mesopotamia and go try his luck on the frontier. While they were getting everything ready, Haran died, and Mr. Terah was very sad about this. But Haran had a boy named Lot, so when Terah and his sons finally got ready to migrate to the frontier, Lot went along with them. Terah, Abram, Nahor, and Lot, along with some of their friends, relatives, and neighbors, made up a wagon train and started out west. They came to what looked like a good piece of land and settled down and built a thriving community that they named after the dead son Haran. They grew rich and prosperous and acquired a lot of land and cattle and became important people in the new land that was being settled. But one day, God appeared to Abram in a vision and said, "Abram, I want you to leave this land and all your relatives and go on further into the frontier to a land I have picked out for you. You will have lots of descendants, and I will make your name to be great, and you will be a blessing to all mankind." Now that's pretty exciting. So Abram told all his relatives about the vision he had had and invited them to come with him. In the meantime, Terah had died, and Nahor wasn't very adventuresome, so he decided to stay where he was. The young man Lot, however, thought it was going to be a great adventure and asked if he could tag along with his uncle Abram. Abram said, "Sure, glad to have you." Abram was a pretty important rancher, and he had a lot of cattle. He gathered together all his livestock and all his cowboys and some covered wagons to carry his possessions in, and a chuck wagon, and off they went into the wild blue yonder. Lot also had a lot of stock and some cowboys. Together they made quite a big party. They headed out west first, and then cut to the south and came into the land of the Canaanites, moving down the foothills between the Jordan River Valley and the mountains further to the west. The land looked good, and from time to time they would consult one another about whether they had come to a place that they could settle. But Abram was waiting for a word from the Lord, so they kept on going. Finally, God appeared to Abram and told him, "This is the place." Abram then pitched camp, built an altar, and worshipped God. They were about halfway between a couple of towns called Bethel and Ai in the foothills that paralleled the Jordan Valley. This was the place God told Abram to stop, but Abram must have thought God was really testing his faith, for there was a drought there, and the land was all dried up, and there wasn't nearly enough grass for all the cattle. They could see it was good land if only it would ever rain, but they obviously couldn't stay there with all their livestock. Now Abram heard from some of the local gossip that there was a good market for his cattle down in Egypt, so they all decided to push on and try their luck in Egypt, and maybe they could come to Canaan after the drought was broken. I haven't told you yet about Abram's wife. As a schoolgirl, she had been the most popular, the most likely to succeed, the homecoming queen and all that. And she was a real beauty. If she had been living in our time, she'd have been a movie star or a fashion model or something like that. Her name was Sarai, and everybody that saw her fell head over heels in love with her. Abram began to get worried. Going down into the land of the Egyptians among strangers with such a good-looking wife, he was afraid the Egyptians would kill him so they could take Sarai away from him. So he did something foolish and cowardly too. When he got to Egypt, he introduced Sarai to everybody as his sister. Sure enough, the king of the Egyptians, they called him the Pharaoh, fell madly in love with Sarai and began to court her. Having told such a big lie, Abram was stuck with it and didn't know how to get out of the mess he found himself in. The Pharaoh had Sarai and Abram over to dinner and threw a big dance for them. The Pharaoh even began to shower Abram with gifts like pedigreed cattle, fine horses, a gold jewelry, a beautiful saddle, and such, so much it began to get embarrassing. Sure enough, as you might expect, the Pharaoh finally found out that Sarai was Abram's wife instead of his sister, And boy, was he mad. He called Abram in and bawled him out good, and I kind of think Abram deserved it, don't you? He told him to take his wife and get out of the country before he lost his temper and did something for which they'd all be sorry. So Abram and his wife, Sarai, and Lot, and all of his cowboys left Egypt and returned to the land of Canaan, back to the place God had told them to settle down in the first place. By that time, they'd had a good rain, and the grass was growing back. So Abram and Lot settled down to ranching. After a while, however, both Abram and Lot had so many cows that there was not enough grazing land for both of them. And Lot's cowboys and Abram's cowboys got into a nasty fight over a watering place. Abram knew that would never do, so he called Lot in for a conference and told him to choose what land he wanted, and Abram would move his herds somewhere else. So Lot looked the country over and selected the best grazing land for himself, the fertile, well-watered land down in the valley. You know how it is when you have two apples and offer your friend one and give him his choice. He's liable to take the best one, and there you are left with the little one for yourself. That's the way it was with Abram. There really wasn't much he could do, being a gentleman, but to offer Lot his choice. Lot chose the valley, so they held a roundup, and Abram gathered together all his cattle and moved them back into the hill country to the west. But God appeared to Abram in another vision and said, "Don't you worry, my good friend. One of these days all this land will belong to you and your descendants. You have my word on it." So Abram moved his camp to a place near the town of Hebron and started ranching in that area and built himself a chapel where he could worship God, because Abram was very religious. Just like our own pioneer ancestors were constantly threatened by Indian raids, the people of Abram's time also had to be on the lookout all the time, because there were wild tribes that would go on the warpath every now and then. Sure enough, after Lot had settled in the Jordan Valley, a bunch of renegades from 4 different tribes, under the leadership of a war chief named Chedorlaomer, invaded the land. They went around burning and killing everything and everybody that got in their way. The 2 main towns in the Jordan Valley were Sodom and Gomorrah. These 2 towns, together with the towns of Admah, Zeboim, and Bela, formed a posse to go out and fight Chedorlaomer. They came into the valley of Shinar and got into a big fight. Chedorlaomer gave them such a licking as you never did see. That left the towns undefended, so Chedorlaomer and his renegades took over the towns and stole everything that was loose and carried off all the people as captives, including Lot and his family, who had taken refuge in the town of Sodom when they heard that Chedorlaomer was on the warpath. One of the survivors of the battle came to Abram and told him what had happened. Abram sent around all the neighboring ranchers, and they quickly formed another posse to go chasing after Chedorlaomer to see if they could rescue Lot and the other captives. All together, they had 318 fighting men. They picked up the trail of the renegades and chased after them and finally caught up with them at a place called Dan. With Abram leading them, they planned their tactics very carefully, because old Chedorlaomer was real tough. So they divided into 2 forces and waited until after dark, and at a signal swooped down on Chedorlaomer's camp and took him by surprise. Well, sir, it was a complete victory. Chedorlaomer was killed, and his men took to the hills, and all the booty was recaptured, and the prisoners were freed. When they all got back home, the mayors of Sodom and Gomorrah came out to welcome them, and in gratitude offered to let Abram keep all the loot they had retaken from Chedorlaomer. Abram, however, said he wouldn't keep as much as a shoelace for himself, that everything ought to be returned to its rightful owner. I think that was real decent of Abram, don't you? The capital city of the whole country was a town called Jerusalem, which was inhabited at that time by a lot of folks called Jebusites. And they had a ruler who was a sort of combination of bishop and governor, a man named Melchizedek, who knew about the true God and worshipped him. When the Jebusites heard what Abram had done, Melchizedek paid him a visit and gave him a very special blessing in the name of the Most High God, as they referred to him. Abram was pleased with the blessing Melchizedek gave him, so he gave Melchizedek a big contribution for his church. After this, the countryside had peace for a while. I wish I could say they lived happily ever after, but it's hardly ever like that, is it? The end.